colour pie is the central pillar of Magic the Gathering. It provides not just mechanical direction for card design and deck building, but in each of the 5 colours, a clear ideal for players to align themselves to. However, the first in the pie, white, is currently the most underrepresented colour in competitive play and widely regarded as having the weakest colour identity. But have things always been this way? And what does the future hold for this so-called support colour? Welcome to Magic the Flavouring, the podcast where we talk about all things Magic flavour, design and lore. My name's Andy Mann.
Hello, I'm Nathan Canson.
And we are going to be doing a cycle of colour pie episodes. This is the first in the series, obviously. We're going to be talking about white. The way we're going to structure this is we're going to be just talking about the general ideas, thematic sort of tenets of each colour, what they actually bring to the table flavour-wise. And then something that you wanted to do, Nathan, you wanted to have a look at Alpha.
Yeah, it's the first, obviously, inception of the game's colour pie, as it were. It didn't have quite such a strong identity back then. Richard Garfield didn't necessarily build the game with this grandiose lore that we have now. But it's good to have a little look at the roots, if we're going to look by each colour and kind of how it's represented these days, what its iconography really is, and the mechanics that fit into it. Where did it start? Is there any correlation directly? Are there any mechanics that have stuck around throughout the entire history? Are there some that have been sidelined, or maybe some that have moved into other colours?
Yeah, I guess a good way to look at the flavour, how it is now, is to kind of see where it's come from. And it seems to be that colour pie, especially for white at the moment, is a bit of a hot topic with people.
Yeah. I mean, I think the whole point at the moment is that we're not necessarily looking in terms of mechanical viability or competitiveness. But recently, especially with EDH, which is one of the more flavourful formats, it is. Yeah, it's a little bit subsided. It's cast off a little because all of the things that make EDH decks good, white tends to fall a little short on. And we're going to look into kind of why that is, how that might be looked at and addressed going forwards. Because if it is a hot topic, Watts are usually pretty good at jumping on these kinds of things. Yeah, sure.
Well, I guess the first question really to talk about white is why is white so shit? Why is it the worst? Why is it the worst colour?
I guess the whole point there is that the two big things that you really want. Well, I guess the idea is that its mechanics are quite simple, they're not particularly complicated. The basic idea and principle of white is this idea of community. So if you've got a bunch of small creatures, which white inherently does, and its most competitive archetype is White Weenie. Yeah, has been around for a long time. It's still viable now. It's making waves in Pioneer. A lot of random white cards are jumping up in price because it's solidifying itself as a good deck in the meta game. Apart from that, you don't really necessarily have a lot of flexibility in terms of what it can mechanically do. Things like Life Gain, which is inherently a white mechanic, isn't very competitive. A lot of its smaller creatures can be beaten out by sweeper effects, whether they're wrath effects that will destroy everything, or things like Anger of the Gods from the original Theros, which is 3 damage to each creature. These kinds of effects are always in and around Magic, and it's quite easy to take advantage of creature strategies if they're doing it in a mundane fashion. Yeah. And white tends to do it in a bit more of a mundane fashion. It wants to build up slow board advantage, which inherently is going to be fairly weak to virtual card advantage in your hands because it's much more easily attacked.
Yeah. Well, I suppose that is a bit of a leading question. I don't actually think white is bad. No. I kind of think white gets a bit of a bum rap, to be honest with you. White is kind of seen as being, as I said in the sort of the prelude, at the moment it's very underrepresented in competitive play, things like individual cards, deck lists in many different single one-on-one formats. White is almost non-existent.
It's always going to be a support colour in those kinds of formats because the things like card draw or ramp aren't put into that colour, so it's going to have to make that up somewhere else. Yeah,
but I think as we go through, because obviously this is a flavour podcast, we don't want to get too bogged down in how represented it is in competitive play, but I do think it's worth addressing that maybe people... I don't think white is bad, I just think the things that white does, maybe other colours, because they can do it as well, it's not maybe appreciated that that's a white thing. Yeah. Or when we look in terms of EDH and how EDH works, the things that white does, I think, are very strong, but because of how it does it, people don't play them because they're seen as being oppressive or whatever.
Yeah, the things it does well, it usually does so well that it's, as you say, oppressive. The things that it does typically well in other formats doesn't necessarily work in the same way that, say, red damage spells don't scale well in EDH. Yeah. And they've got quite a few ways of that they've shored up this weakness recently with, say, Toolbrand or whatever from Eldraine.
Oh, Toolbrand's great.
You don't necessarily have that with white. Even life gain decks, you can make the most ridiculous life gain decks, and they can be very abusive, and they can do some very degenerate things, but they usually rely on other colours like black or something like that to be able to do it. And if white's key strengths require other colours to make them viable, then clearly white's obviously in its isolated in concept is maybe a little bit weaker. And especially these days, everyone wants every colour and every colour combination to be viable. In EDH, if you have a white commander, every card has to be white.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily have all of the skill within its own within its own little colour pie space to be able to do all of that.
But I think it does have potential, and as we go through, like, and thematically as well, I don't think you need to crowbar any new mechanics or any new pathways into white. I think certain things just need to be bolstered up. And we'll get there. That'll be more towards the end of what we'll be talking about. We'll get there. But firstly, we do need to kind of just discuss what actually it means to be a white colour pie Magic card in Magic. Like, what does it actually mean to have a white deck, or to have a white aligned deck, or be a white mage?
Well, how is it currently represented?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I guess the first, and obviously I've already mentioned, is community. This idea of lots of little guys all working together. This society. It usually works well within like village structures or town structures. Like Innistrad was a really good example of this, of having a bunch of 1/1s, like little humans that all help each other based on whether or not, you know, if your buddy dies, then every is going to get a little bit bigger, or creating multiple tokens. And this strategy of having lots of little guys all working together to essentially overrun your opponent, and that sense of community will outbeat, say, a single 5/5 creature.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And I suppose like a lot of the way that they try and represent this is, I mean, because white is, I guess white you could kind of call the everyman colour.
Yeah.
And it does get put into that sort of community trope. So a lot of cards, especially from things like Innistrad or Dominaria, you're making humans.
Yeah.
Things like Gather the Townsfolk, you know, you're making little humans.
Yeah, it feels like the thing you can represent from yourself most easily.
Yeah.
Like it's almost as if like a lot of say like D&D might like being like the barbarian, or like the big the dwarf berserk or whatever, because they feel of themselves as like, you know, the slightly larger gentleman kind of side of things. So it's much easier to affiliate yourself with something that you recognise.
Yeah, sure.
It's much harder to pretend to be a dragon than it is to pretend to be, you know, a hunter.
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, this community aspect comes into the idea of playing lots of little creatures, lots of human synergies, like things like knights and soldiers as well.
It tends to care a lot about, I mean, not obviously other colours do as well, but it will care a lot about, say, humans, knights, the creature type, trying to fit into that you know, uniformity of community.
Yeah, sure. And that also leads into one of the big sort of themes I think that white does flavorfully rather than other colours, is this idea of religion in a weird way.
Yeah.
And you have to be kind of careful with religion, especially in a kind of mainstream game, because you don't want to make assumptions about real world religions that people hold, but you can't get away from the fact that things like in Innistrad, the Church of Avacyn is the white aligned church. Things obviously in Amonkhet, obviously all 5 colours had their god, but I think the one that Gideon, when he's going through that storyline, he aligns himself with a Ketra, because she's the white aligned thing. That feels almost very sacred, that idea of the Ketra is the most sort of sacred out of all of them from a religious aspect.
I guess also most fantasy tropes across most games, there will always be a church, regardless of the fact you have, like, obviously demons fit into that idea of heaven and hell as well.
Yeah.
But when you've got all these dragons and these weird elves and monsters running around, like, there's still this idea of a church typically, which is quite strange when you think that it wouldn't fit. It might not be, you know, the capital God side of, like, you know, it might not be a Christian church, but there's always this idea of a good, like a true and just church that kind of goes against all of the hobgoblin-y nonsense that's going on elsewhere. So white definitely fits more into that side, and then you can look at the amorality of it. Like we'll look at this a little bit later, but that idea of structured religion fitting into white, it create, usually if you're going to have a community in a fantasy aspect, it will be built around a church anyway.
Yeah, sure.
The way that it happens in, say, England, for example, is through hamlets would form around churches that you'd pilgrimage to, and then from there they'd grow into towns, then into cities. So you tend to find that the bigger the church is within the town, the bigger the town tends to be.
Yeah, sure.
So if anything, that idea of society was directly correlated to the Christian church in the way that it found in our country.
Yeah.
And it's funny, we'll look at this in Alpha. There's a lot of representation of this.
Yeah.
Before there was any magic related story.
Yeah.
You'll see that the way that white is kind of represented is structured based around this idea of a religious base.
Yeah, sure. I think the idea, the word here is sort of sacred as well, because you have different communities, and each of their colours, especially in sets where you do have very physical gods like Theros and Amonkhet, obviously it's all based around community, it's all based around religion, but the white ones always tend to be more sort of self-righteous and sort
pure.
of sacred. Yeah,
because you've got like the angels, which are physical manifestations of concentrated white mana.
Yeah,
and it's very easy to see they're supposed to be just. I mean, Avacyn was obviously a great example, created by a white-black vampire. Fair enough.
Yeah,
but was this idea, this purity? But I mean,
Avacyn, you're right. Yeah, he was.
I say infallible. Absolutely was flawed by
was
the end of it.
completely corrupted. But I like your idea that you're saying, he was made by a white-black vampire, but it was definitely Sorin. The reason he made Avacyn was to try and address the balance within the communities of Innistrad.
Yeah.
The vampires and all of the different terrors of the night were overtaking and starting to kill off all the humans. Mm-hmm. So to keep the communities going, to bring the world back into balance, and this idea of pulling together, he made Avacyn. Yeah. So that's definitely his white side.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, you could technically argue that the only reason he did that was to ensure there was still cattle for the animals, for the wolves to feed.
Well, I mean, what do you want from me?
I'm just saying. But realistically, yeah, she was there to be as a plate of morality. Shining a beacon for the
and also another the cycle of angels, the legendary angels on Innistrad. They are all like color white.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, So this idea of I guess it's peace and justice as well. I guess is a very white kind of concept. That morality aspect, like a lot of its removal falls under this category. Whether it's something like Swords of Plowshares was the original single white removal spell, where it's this idea of the soldiers having their swords removed instead of like having scythes or whatever to go back to the harvest. This idea of forget war, go back to your homestead. And then they had this continuing on with like things like Path to Exile, Condemn. Those kinds of effects where it's a trade-off of it's justly removing the creature. It's a justified destruction rather than say red or black where it's going to be wanton.
So yeah, the idea of removal being just as well is quite a white thing, because as you say, it's always removal with some sort of caveat, right?
Yeah.
So you have like a lot of white creatures, things like Fiend Hunter or Banisher Priest, all those kinds of things. It's not just hard removal; it's always removal with this idea that potentially you get your creatures back.
There's a caveat to it. It's not. It's like, as I say, it's not wanton destruction or malicious killing. It's usually retribution. It's usually like it's an answer to someone else's threat rather than instigating the violence.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I like that idea. I like that idea a lot. Yeah, it's not. It's detaining rather than just straight moving, or even things like with Path to Exile and Swords of Plowshares. The opponent which you're exiling their creature always gets something back from it. Right?
Yeah. It's a reactive. It's a reactive trade-off rather than a proactive antagonization.
I think the other thing that you could fit into Justice, because so just as a heads up for people listening, this is actually something that you wrote these outlines, and that you're big on this colour pie. And I like the fact that in the Peace and Justice side of things, you've put this idea that everything is kind of equal around the table. So when you look at things like board wipes,
yes, exactly. Yeah.
Board wipes tend to be very clean board wipes. They tend to blow up destroy all creatures, destroy all lands. Yeah,
compare, say, Wrath of God to Ingaruk's Wake. So Wrath of God, again, we'll talk about this a little later when we look at Alpha, is a very fair wrath, because it's just destroy all creatures and they can't be regenerated. There is no caveat, there's nothing that's getting around it, just everything wipes back. And it's this almost idea of removing the conflict. It's not. It wants everything to be over. Everything to. Can everyone just be friends? I mean, you're destroying all the creatures, but in terms of the planeswalkers battling each other, it's just the two of them. Then there's no conflicting creatures or
Can we
animals.
Just be friends? Well, this is something that White does, and I think it's really interesting with everything else that kind of White does. Is that White always seems to have, when we talk about things like peace and justice or community, all these things, they sound like quite wholesome words. But the thing about White is that, and I suppose the thing about all the colours is that the people who do game design, especially nowadays, but I think it's always been this case, or maybe not with Alpha, but certainly in more recent years, is that white isn't necessarily good, black isn't necessarily bad. Yeah. They have more nuanced tropes.
There's moral ambiguity.
So the idea that white's kind of going, it's equal, guys, we've blown up all of our stuff. It's like, but you did that on your terms, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You decided to just...
There's no such thing as a fair Armageddon.
Yeah, it's almost like, it's almost like a blind faith thing. And this is something like that we see time and time again, is this idea of white kind of going, but don't worry, guys, it's fair for everyone.
Yeah, Rout sounds like a great card because it's like, you're undermining an ambush, and then you put Elish Norn on the artwork, and suddenly you can't feel too justified in it anymore. Or Fumigate, you're like, okay, you're getting rid of a pest, and then you think, all those poor well, those poor little gremlins, they didn't deserve that.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, it tries to sugarcoat it a little bit.
It's not righteousness, it's self-righteousness.
A chroma's vengeance. It's not vengeance isn't a good thing.
No. Like, but it's like divine retribution, isn't it?
Exactly.
And that's why things like all these angels and stuff like that, you know, as characters or as sort of designs, they're not defensive. They're quite aggressive.
Yeah,
like, things like Baneslayer Angel and stuff like that.
Exactly. Baneslayer Angel's Baneslayer Angel's not nice. She's not a nice girl. She's going around bitch slapping all manner of creatures out of the sky. But I guess you could look at the problem with where that comes down is that if you try and justify, that's the thing, if you're trying to justify your action through religious intent or through that idea of justice, that is very, very subjective.
Yeah, sure.
It's not an objective thing at all.
No.
And again, we'll look into the flavour of Alpha and maybe where this stems from. But it's going to be a very hard thing to move away from because you're always the good guy from your perspective. You know, it's very easy to be objective and say that certain black characters are inherently evil and certain white characters are inherently good. Say, like Gideon. You couldn't say that Gideon was a bad guy.
No.
But obviously, from his point of view, he's the good guy. From the Eldrazi's point of view, it's not their bloody fault.
No.
You know, they're just doing what they do.
Well, the thing with Gideon as well...
Gideon's a menace.
The whole thing with Gideon, his kind of story arc in sort of the modern game, is that from his origins, he came from a place of self-righteousness and almost like blind...
Well, yeah, because Theros was very... that when you have a literal pantheon that sit on the horizon, like kind of judging you to follow them, it's kind of quite difficult to not have a kind of skewed morality. And obviously it's the lens that we look through the game at. And a lot of the characters that we follow the story from are characters like Elspeth or Gideon or Ajani that it's very hard to find fault in their character because that's kind of the way that the fantasy trope works. If you need the good guy. And White does a very good job of maintaining that. And for the most part, when it does stray into the negative side of it, which we'll again talk about in a little bit, it does it in a very clear way that doesn't feel... It doesn't feel muddled. It doesn't feel muddled at all. It feels very clear and how they're doing it, which is quite nice. I mean, white's a lot easier to conceptualize than some of the other colors because it has always remained quite narrow in its ideal.
Yeah, it's remained consistent to its idea.
Yeah, which might be a limitation on why maybe mechanically they get stuck, which is an interesting point to bring up. But it does mean that from a flavourful point of view, you do have a bit more integrity.
Yeah, sure. I mean, but then I think we are seeing change. So just talking about board wipes at the moment, a lot of the earlier board wipes are things like Armageddon, Destroy All Lands. I mean, obviously there's inherently a problem there, especially in formats like EDH. You got things like Wrath of God. Interesting that Wrath of God, I think, obviously they have, not only do they have the word God in the word, but they have Wrath of God, which has a lot of connotations.
They probably won't reprint that again.
No, but they kind of reprinted it with Day of Judgment, which... I mean, arguably, isn't any more ambiguous about what it's trying to say. No, but I think it's just enough.
The subject is
ambiguous. The subject, they've just removed it enough.
Whose judgment?
Yeah, exactly. But these are all like properly clean board wipes that, because it has to be about conviction and because it has to be about completely wiping the board, it does put white at a disadvantage because where do you go from there? Yeah. But I think they are changing it because if you look at something like Realmcloak Giant from Eldraine, that is a board wipe that is very clear cut, destroy all creatures, but it does have all non-giant creatures, and then because of its adventure mechanics, so the adventure is destroy all non-giant creatures, but then as a creature itself, you can bring it back. Yeah. So it does give it a bit more flexibility, right?
I guess mechanically they're trying to balance the fact that white struggles after a board wipe to gain... If white... Because white inherently, with the whole community aspect, has a lot of very cheap creatures. So if you do the thing where you play a lot of cheap creatures to begin with, then you wrath the board, you've put yourself at a disadvantage. Yes, you might be able to then play out small creatures again afterwards quicker, but you haven't had the card draw to be able to keep you up with that. You haven't had the mana ramp to be able to justify having more lands to do that. So you're inherently almost shooting yourself in the foot because your defense mechanism is also hurting yourself. Yeah. Whereas if they've tried to do cards, say like Phyrexian Rebirth, where it's 4 white to destroy all creatures and you get an XX artifact horror token. Yeah. Okay, it's a Phyrexian card, so the white side, the flavour of that is a little bit more twisted because obviously you're creating a horror token, which doesn't seem very, very white. But if you look at even something like Planar Cleansing, that's destroy all non-white creatures. There are some flexes where it's not completely like castrating itself just to gain parity, because parity is fine if you're a colour that can break parity. white can't very easily.
No.
One of the other things when I look at now is when you look into like the way it handles law and uniformity.
Law and uniformity is another big white thing, right?
Yeah, and it has a lot of these parity effects, these almost like taxation effects. You have cards like Ghostly Prison, where you can't be attacked unless a creature's controller pays 2 mana per creature that's attacking you. Smothering Tithe, a very good recent addition, which is a fantastic space for white to look into, where whenever your opponent draws a card, they have to pay a certain amount of mana, otherwise you gain a treasure back. And the idea is for this that if you want to have an advantage, you're going to have to pay for it.
Yeah, sure.
And then when you're looking, so that's like the law, that idea of restricting you down to a certain amount of resource, which then helps white kind of keep up when it's inherently a bit behind anyway.
Yeah, sure.
And this uniformity, this parity aspect comes down with things like Rule of Law, where you can only play 1 spell per turn, and that's each player. Eidolon of the Rhetoric, where you can only draw 1 card each turn.
Yeah.
Spirit of the Labyrinth, where again you can only play 1 spell each turn. I might have got those names mixed around, but they're both from the original Theros, the enchantment creatures. These are all white effects where they try and essentially ensure that no one's getting out of control.
Yeah, I actually think that the lore aspects of white is something that they could lean way more into than, say, the old sort of tropes of peace and justice and community. I mean, community is definitely something, and when we talk about things like anthem effects and where they can take those, that definitely falls into community as well. So I think there's legs there.
Yeah.
But the peace and justice, quote unquote, morality side of white, I actually think is something they should probably just ditch a little bit. Like they can have flavors of that in individual characters, but this idea of law and like sort of self-perceived righteousness is much more rich and has a lot more legs for wiggle room mechanically and flavorfully than any of the other aspects.
Yeah, I agree. I guess the idea is that, when we look at Alpha, it will kind of solidify this, is that you don't want to lose sight of where your original, what your original concept for the colour was. Mm-hmm. But as with any medium, you have to grow up a little bit into your own design space. Yeah. And if you do keep white limited to these ideas, it will. And if you say because it hasn't done this before, if it does it before, it's a break or a bend in the color pie. Yeah. Then you're never going to give it the flexibility to be able to keep up anyway. Yeah, sure. And it's annoying that if it is a color that's trying to hold itself true to these values, it's going to restrict you as a designer as much as it's going to restrict the color itself is from a flavor point of view. Yeah, sure. Like, it's very hard to build up a band of rebels and put them in white and make them marauders. Like, white kind of already constricts itself by its concept. Yeah, that you kind of need to allow its mechanics to flex outside of that a little. Of course, everything that we're talking about as well is based on the idea that we're talking about mono color sort of ideals. Yeah, because obviously white, it's the support color, but white and black and has a lot of this kind of idea. White and red has a lot of this kind of idea. Yeah, we'll have to, obviously we'll look at obviously when you get into like two color combinations, it's usually a nice middle ground between two colors that overlap. Well, that's exactly the idea, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. So we'll look into that when a little bit further down the line, but white by itself, obviously, these are the things it's bringing to the table, and it's not the only color that will necessarily do it, but it's obviously the color that's only doing these things. Yeah. Other colors get to have a bit, maybe that this is the furthest left that the color goes, and then it has a far right, whereas white doesn't really have a far left and a far right. The most aggressive it gets is the fact that it has a bunch of vanilla creatures that are really, really, really well costed. Sure. So 1 mana, 2/1s. But that doesn't stop it from being impressive, though. Like, whilst we're in lore and uniformity as a kind of trope, something that falls directly into this is the idea of stacks effects. Yeah. Yeah, I guess, the idea of if you have all of these different effects that stop your opponent, or little by little stop your opponent, and you have them all on top of each other, then it makes it very difficult for your opponent to do anything, to the point of where you've limited their game plan because they weren't accommodating for the fact they might only be able to play one spell a turn. Yeah, sure. They might their game plan might be that it needs to double down or hold up, say, a protection spell or things like that. Yeah, but I think it's weird because these idea of stacks effects. So I mean, stacks. By what I mean by stacks is that it's again this taxation effect, but instead of you being able to pay your way out of it, it's more, I don't know, it's a bit more oppressive. Well, yeah, so the idea is there's a few artifacts that do the same thing of where they'll keep a certain number of your permanents tapped each turn, or you'll have to sacrifice a permanent each turn. And it's almost this idea of that you're constantly keeping your opponent's resources under pressure, which is exceptionally frustrating. Yeah, but I mean, I don't know. There's got to be for them, obviously. Not for the person. Like, it's odd, isn't it? So, like a stacks card. I mean, would you agree that, say, Aven Mind Center is a stacks card? Yeah, absolutely. So, anything that creates like a global limit, and not necessarily global, but at least sets a limitation for all of your opponents if it's not for all players.
Yeah, but the thing is with that, and this is actually where I think, because I am not a big fan of stacks strategies, playing against them or even playing them, but I think there are definitely degrees, and I think the baby sometimes gets thrown out with the bathwater on this. So something like Aven Mind Sensor, which is so it's 2 and a white for an Aven creature.
2/1 flash flying.
2/1 flash flying, and it forces your opponents, they can't search deeper than the top 4 cards of their library.
Yeah,
right?
whenever they search for anything. Yeah. Anything that's searching their library, whether it's cracking a fetch lands, whether it's trying to tutor for a card, whether it's one of those effects where you're looking at, say, trying to think, like, if you're for, even like, say, for a specific card, like, say, I don't know, the original Nissa Ravain, that used to get like Elvish Warrior or whatever.
Yeah,
something
but the
like
thing is, though, it's still like soft stacks, though, right?
Yeah.
So it's so like
you
I used
could
to play
essentially make your opponent do something, and then they don't get the required effect.
Yeah, and I think it's fine because they're still letting you. I think this is where White kind of gets hated out a little bit. Is you're still letting someone search the top 4 cards of their library.
Yeah. If they're
it's
using
not like
a vampiric tutor,
search library.
It's still like your best out of the top 4 for 1 mana, which is maybe. I mean, it's not the worst. It's better than Impulse. It's a half mana Impulse.
Yeah.
But I guess the whole point is that it's. I mean, beyond the fact that it can kind of trip up people that are just playing something simple like a Rampant Growth, which is probably where the unfair side of it kind of falls into. You're probably stopping them from doing something obnoxious anyway, like limiting someone's tutor to the top 4 cards. Yeah, they can be really angry, but they were just about to tutor.
Yeah.
Like, from a White point of view, like, where you don't necessarily get, okay, you're having Light and Tutor, and you have, what's the other one? 3 mana. I can't remember. It's Enchantment, whatever. Idyllic Tutor.
Idyllic Tutor, there we go.
So you do have some, but, like, you're usually not doing something that isn't you're not doing something unfair. You're stopping someone else from doing something unfair, which weirdly enough feels way more unfair than just doing something unfair back.
Sure.
So if your opponent does something ridiculous and you do something ridiculous back, they're like, "Oh yeah, well, fair play."
I mean,
if you go, "Well, you can't do something ridiculous," they go, "Well, screw you." Like, what? I don't want to play with you anymore.
I mean,
then.
this is me defending those kinds of effects. However, I did used to play an Aven Mind Sensor in my Karametra EDH deck. So Karametra is all about searching lands out of your library. Now, we play in quite a steal your creature heavy meta.
I play a lot of steal effects.
You play a lot of steal effects. So the first thing I did when I started playing EDH with you is I took out my Erebos God of the Dead out of my life gain deck because you stopped me from gaining life with it, and then my deck shut off.
Brilliant.
And then I played.
Put the cards that are best against you in your deck, so Nathan can just go yoink. Yeah, thanks. I'll have that.
And as much as I've just gone, well, it still lets you search the top 4 cards of your library. When you stole Aven Mind Sensor when I was playing Karametra, that was incredibly frustrating.
Yeah,
to the point where I did actually take her out. So and I've replaced it with something else.
I'm glad you've eventually done that. I didn't realise. That's annoying. That's what I'm going to take.
I mean, I replaced it with a Great Henge, so it's still just as annoying. But there we go. They're not comparable cards at all. But I kind of went, well, if I'm taking that out, I'm going to bung out something.
But the idea is, I guess, if this is one big slot of its colour pie. And it does feel to be oppressive in the same way like Armageddon Destroy All Lands is. You're never playing it fairly. You're never playing it to go, right, let's start again, guys. You're usually playing it having floated a bit of mana or having like a load of artifacts mana.
Yeah.
You're usually playing it to try and absolutely castrate your opponent.
Yeah.
And so maybe it's Wizards finds it. I mean, they did recently reprint one. It was a 1 mana that you can only play 1 non-creature spell each turn. Deafening Silence.
Yes.
Yeah, from the recent core set, I believe. I think.
Yeah.
And so they're still releasing cards that do these kinds of effects, but they're trying to limit them back. And maybe it's somewhere they could look at to do a little bit more, because other strategies are clearly doing things that are really obnoxious, and White has the opportunity. If it's always already been the colour that tries to set this idea of parity and uniformity, why not lean into that? Why not have it be the police colour? Yes, okay, blue gets all of its counter spells and its bounce effects and stuff, but maybe White should be the colour that allows that should come back to being the colour that says yes or no, you can keep this going, but maybe from a permanent point of view.
Well, this is it. So it shouldn't be
not on the stack.
Blue kind of answers answer for answer, right?
Yeah, and
whereas
also,
White should be creating a board state in which people shouldn't be getting too far ahead.
Leading into this idea of permanent building permanent advantage, which nicely segues into like the next kind of big title for it. It has a lot of artifacts and enchantment synergy.
Sure.
Again, cards that sit permanently on the battlefield. They're not so easy to interact with, say, like as creatures are, but they have very much that idea of you're building up a mass of advantage and accumulated resource on the battlefield.
Yeah.
There are cards like SRAM, which is one of the few ways that you can kind of draw cards consistently in White.
That's SRAM Master.
Artificer. Edificer. Edificer.
Yeah. He's the dwarf legendary
he's
from
a dwarf artificer who is an
Kaladesh.
edificer. Yeah, exactly. And then whenever you cast a vehicle, an equipment, or an aura spell,
that's the
you
one.
draw a card.
Yeah.
Stoneforge Mystic, which is an equipment tutor, which allows you to put them from your hand onto the battlefield, circumnavigating some mana. Again, like these. I've put the cards we've put are actually quite funny because they kind of get around the main issues that White has. I mean, there are lots of cards that White do this in White, but maybe these are the best examples of how to take advantage of them. Like Sigarda's Aid is a really good one as well.
All right, so I'm going to challenge you slightly here. So you wrote this outline and you said that you're putting down artifact synergies, whereas when I think of artifact synergies, I don't think of White at all. I think of red and blue because that's the kind of mad scientist trope. That's the kind of mad builders. Every colour has artifact synergies.
Green tends not to very much at all. To the point of where when Mirrodin for the first artifact play we had, they had to literally release the fifth sun.
Yeah.
For it to because it wasn't originally part.
I mean that's fair. I was trying to think of.
And black doesn't necessarily.
No, but it does have an individual cases depending on the mechanics.
Yeah, I usually find plane to plane. Obviously the ones. These days we've had so many artifact planes. It's easy for you to find some spells, especially if you're working with EDH.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's
easy for you to find the cards that have artifact interaction because certain sets are more artifact based, like Kaladesh.
Yeah. Well, that's it. So I recently built an EDH deck for a Secret Santa project that we were doing at our LGS, and it was a Sidri Galvanic Genius Vehicles deck. Obviously, that's being in Esper colours. And actually, you'd be surprised at how many black cards there are that synergize. I mean, a lot of them are from Kaladesh, but all of them.
Esper was also the artifact plane of Alara, obviously being black, white, and blue. I think blues obviously works a lot with cards like people like Urza. And you've even got in Eldraine, you've got Emery.
Exactly.
There are, I think, I guess White does
my point
work
is
more with like equipment.
Equipment, exactly.
Or see vehicles as well. Had White had, especially Kaladesh, it was white red that was the vehicle colour.
But I would say, I'd say vehicles and lean more towards artifact creatures and equipment. Vehicles lean more towards equipments than they do. Traditional
artifact, absolutely. They're just kind of a slightly different way of doing them in a fair
But that's something thematically good because the idea of equipment in White is the idea that it's the knights taking up their holy sword,
taking up their arms,
or it's building that holy relic to take something on, or something like Balan, Wandering Knight.
Yeah,
it's that idea that you have
that multifaceted, like a jack of all trade where you could use a bow, you can find swords from a bow.
Sigarda's Aid is a blessing, right? Sigarda's Aid is the 1 mana enchantment which makes equip cost 0.
Yeah.
Is that right? So that's a blessing from that.
Character. It allows you to, when you put them in play, to automatically equip them. I think you can play them with flash.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
The idea is that it's not
hammer.
You're not using this contraption artifact like a mad scientist would, or
it's not forming it. It's almost using them and salvaging them. It's funny. In the original Mirrodin, red was the Volshoks were the more equipment based, and the Urioks were more based in returning artifacts from the graveyard. Volshoks being the reds, the red lines, humans of Mirrodin.
Is it what that Koth?
Yeah, Koth of the Hammer is obviously their most famous. Orioks, the Orioks were the white lines. They also worked a lot with equipment. The Leonin, obviously having a lot to do with you had Leonin Shikari, which allows you to equip at instant speed. Obviously, Mirrodin was the first equipment set, so there's going to be a lot of equipment synergies across some of the colours.
Yeah.
But even if you look at things like, say, Refurbish, where you get to bring back all of artifacts and enchantments from the graveyard, you've got Open the Vaults that does the same thing.
Yeah.
Second Sunrise that does the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like, White does like bringing back little trinkets quite a lot.
Yeah, so I'd say artifacts is fine, but I think more specifically we need to be talking about equipment.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I suppose that. Yeah, it's the more that. Yeah,
it just fits more well.
Yeah, well, I guess it's also the same thing with White does tend to have enchantment synergy, but it's more with the aura side, which again, maybe it weakens it because auras are inherently weaker because you need the creature or whatever it is that it's targeting to be around, and then you get 2 for 1 quite easily if you do find a way to remove it. And we'll talk about this in a little bit, but green has a lot of a lot of enchantment synergy as well. But the idea is that White inherently does like working with things that are in play, that are on your board.
Yeah.
And obviously all these tax effects that we're talking about are inherently permanents that need to stick around as well.
Yeah, because it's building up your township, right?
Yeah,
it's building up your board state.
Absolutely,
it ties in with this whole kind of community aspect.
And this is kind of where it gains its card advantage from, is by having these engines that you can build up in play that work together. Instead of, say, having 1 card that draws you 3 cards, you don't get your 3 for 1s in White.
Which is kind of odd that White has all the board board wipes, all the wraths.
Because it needs to at least find some way to recoup a little bit. I mean, it might not necessarily have all of them. I mean, you do have a fair few spells that will destroy all kind of all permanents, including enchantments and artifacts. But if white, I guess it's the idea. It's almost like that failsafe.
Yeah.
Like white needs to have that button of if other people, if other players and other colours do gain this ridiculous advantage, it has a way to go. Here you go. Let's balance the situation.
Yeah, sure.
Speaking of balance, again, we'll come to that when we get to alpha. Like there's a few other effects in white that do it to also your hands. To your even cards like Rest in Peace.
Yeah.
Rest in Peace is a great example of white going, okay, black knows, well, not just black, but most colours know how to use their graveyard really efficiently.
Yeah.
Black being obviously the primary one. Let's make a spell that not only exiles all the cards from graveyards, but also doesn't allow any cards to go to graveyards afterwards.
Yeah.
And again, it's that lockout. It's locking down your opponent's resources and taking certain parts out, like Stony Silence, for example.
Yeah.
Talking about artifacts, it's funny that it has it fits into that side, but 2 and a white. Abilities of artifacts can't be activated.
Yeah, sure.
Absolutely castrate some certain archetypes, especially in like Modern, Pioneer. Also going back to like Legacy. Like,
yeah.
There are a lot of spell effects that it has that completely lock out certain strategies. Very kind of Blood Moon-esque kind of effects where they will literally just you play one card and you can't do anything anymore.
I guess, but I think trying to sort of justify,
and that's why it feels weird
because
it's funny because if you go too weak on these effects, they don't do anything and they're pointless to run.
Yeah.
If you do too much on them, they're utterly oppressive. You feel like you can't make them too often, and it makes the game quite miserable.
Yeah.
So this is where like that idea of where White's niche is usually concepts or mechanical concepts that are a bit far too powerful when you go too far, or not powerful enough if you don't push far.
Sure. So I mean, we've spoken a lot about the themes and how they relate to things mechanically, and maybe why white is underplayed, or maybe why it's not maybe receiving the service at the moment that it does.
Yeah.
But I think to go back to kind of its really heavy themes and ideas, I actually don't think you need to look at a lot of the protagonists of Magic's story, a lot of the people that you would see as sort of being righteous, whatever. For me, some of the most interesting ways that white expresses itself is actually through its antagonists and through its quote-unquote bad guys.
Yeah.
So things like, I mean, you look at all the sort of main, what you'd call mono-white antagonists of Magic. So you have Elish Norn, Grand Cenobite, which is the mono-white Praetor. You have Kondo from Kamigawa block. Yeah, you have maybe smaller antagonists, people like Quende from Dominaria. And what all these characters tend to have in common, and also Heliod, God of the Sun.
Oh, that's son of a bitch, yeah.
He's a big one, right? So what all of these characters I've attributed to their personality is never like your traditional black or red antagonists from Magic. Is the idea that the white ones always tend to have this idea of self-righteousness.
Yeah, it's a twisted worldview.
Yeah,
almost.
It's not just trying to gain power for power's sake.
No.
It's never just trying to accumulate, say, wealth or whatever else.
It's not narcissistic. It tends to feel like they're doing it for the greater good.
Yeah, exactly. So Heliod, God of the Sun, his whole thing. I mean, he's probably the most narcissistic one, but even so, I believe that his killing of Elspeth.
Being narcissistic.
Well, yeah, but his killing of Elspeth wasn't so much that he was trying to maybe stop Elspeth from being too powerful. No. He was trying to protect the status quo of his own pantheon of gods.
Yeah, he saw a threat to his own the way his play works in his position within the pantheon, and he didn't want it to be usurped. Considering that Xenagos had just literally done it already successfully,
exactly.
He was very scared and fearful of Elspeth being another threat that could.
But then, even so, one of Heliod's biggest sort of motivations in that is he just had Xenagos, a mortal, ascend to godhood. But his problem with Elspeth wasn't the same. He could have very easily been mad at Xenagos, this mortal that could have ascended to the pantheon. But the fact that Elspeth just killed Xenagos in the story, Heliod's going,
you just done made away.
You just killed a god, and I can't have that.
You didn't like the fact that was his planeswalker that became a god, so you gave the ability to kill gods to a planeswalker, and then you wondered why you didn't like that. Afterwards?
But it's the idea of his own blind faith in the power of the pantheon. He could have been very easily furious at Xenagos, but actually he was more furious at Elspeth. Do you know what I mean?
It wasn't. She was the one who kind of ruined the way that
exactly
that the system worked.
Elish Norn is another great example. Elish Norn isn't trying to make herself the prime praetor. She's trying to spread the
machine orthodoxy.
The machine orthodoxy church.
I think she's definitely trying to take. I think she succeeded.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I guess
the problem with someone like Phyrexia is it is a constant battle to be not on top, but this idea of control. It's like the idea of the Phyrexians are a unified purpose, and having this five praetors is actually very unlike them. Originally, they were just black.
Yeah, sure.
And then having it split between the 5 colours because it kind of has to work that way in a certain way for sets
for the game. Yeah,
exactly for the game. Elishnor naturally it's almost by proxy of the way that the Phyrexians want to work is the way that the white works. This idea of utilitarian, like
it's a community.
Yeah,
they want to spread
totalitarianism.
Yeah,
it's not democracy.
But
it's
that's
dictatorship.
Like Elishnor was never trying to. That's the thing. Like where she was never trying to selfishly be like, I want to be the most powerful
She's like,
Phyrexian.
This is the way.
This is the way Phyrexian needs to be.
Yeah,
and she was trying to make it for
everything needs
everyone.
to conform to it.
Yeah,
because that is the Phyrexian way as well. And it's technically when it gets legs, that kind of theory is way better than chaos. Chaos is easy to. It's not necessarily easy to maintain because no one's technically maintaining it, but chaos sustains itself.
I mean, chaos morally is actually very righteous because it makes no assertions on anyone.
Exactly, but the idea is that should eventually settle down. Conflict will settle down. Like this idea, if you give this idea that wants to take over your ideal and merge it with its own and convert it into its own ideal, that is once it gets going, that's a really strong concept, and it's really hard to fight against, and it does become quite dangerous.
Yeah. I would say that if Elishnor was to be ever reprinted again, I do think they would probably make her a white-black card. Like, she does feel very white-black to me.
I'm very excited to go back to Phyrexia, I'm not going to lie.
Yeah. I don't think they necessarily will, because it wouldn't work with the kind of 5 colour Phyrexians.
I feel like they might not do the whole Praetor thing again, but it depends, I don't know. They constantly have to reinvent how they fit the colours of a plane into the set. Obviously, it works really well with Eldraine because they did the 5 different courts.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see if they still maintain that going back to Phyrexia, when I think the last we checked, Elishnor did have a substantial control over the situation.
I think mechanically as well, just talking about Elishnor, the idea that she's an anthem effect for your creatures and a de-anthem, a debuff for everything else. I guess you could kind of say that doesn't fit into white because it's not necessarily fair.
If you follow me,
but if you follow Elishnor, you get buffed.
If you don't follow, then you get debuffed.
I think mechanically it might not be the most white thing, but thematically it is. And actually, for white, I think they need to lean into these themes. Yeah. Elishnor's not a new card, but I think looking back
punishment
on it,
of other people following a different way should feel white. The only problem is it does create that idea of a negativity towards structured religion, which again they might still want to try to avoid.
No, but the thing is just to kind of solidify at least my stance on this subject, I don't think Wizards is not a hot button topic for Wizards to kind of maybe say negative things or to have negative ideas of an organised religion.
Yeah,
as long as they're not necessarily going, these real-world religions, we think they're bad, and this is our game way of doing it.
You're not going to get any iconography of a crucifix or anything like that.
No, I don't think anyone's arguing that. Even people in organised religion understand that there's problems with it. But as long as Wizards are at least respectful enough to have them in the context of their plane.
Exactly, and I think you're not making cards like... Back in the day, there were massive issues with certain cards that had like pentagrams and stuff like that in there.
The original demonic tutors,
stuff like that. Yeah, because they weren't making original art. Well, they were, but it's not original stories. It's just using general conceptual art, like how could you represent a demon giving you a transaction? Obviously, you're probably going to look into some satanic cult, and back in the day, it's all you've got to go on is your own kind of,
I suppose we'll move on to Alpha in a minute, but I suppose Demonic Tutor is actually quite a nice little lead-in, because if you look at the 2 different artworks for Demonic Tutor, so the original artwork, which was the very generic demon devil with a pentagram on a tome, and that idea, at least kind of broadly speaking, is that it's always you're making a deal with the devil.
Yeah, exactly.
The new artwork, which they released in Ultimate Masters, was a Ixalani demon with a pirate in a boat.
Yeah, almost leading. It almost felt a little bit like is it Charon, who takes them across the River Styx in the Underworld? It almost felt like that, like you were being led somewhere by
on the
actual demon.
On the face of it, those 2 images aren't very different. It's a human selling their soul to a demon for gain. But because the first one wasn't in any context of this is Magic the Gathering, it's just, here's a demon, we all know they're bad.
It's representative.
Whereas on Ixalan, demons aren't necessarily portrayed as being evil. We don't really get to see demons that much in the story, but it's definitely Ixalan.
Yeah, you don't automatically assume that it's based around some hellish, like you're selling your soul kind of
thing.
Sure. Maybe it's probably still a bad
right?
thing, but you're probably just taking the advice of someone who's got a bit more eldritch knowledge than you
do. And also,
do.
like in fantasy settings, you can do whatever you want. You can flip things on their heads. In the latest Innistrad set, all the angels became crazed and evil.
And
Still
if you look
self-righteous.
look at say Davriel in
Davriel Kane, yeah.
So he has obviously he's tied a lot of demons to himself, and they don't have, they're not just straight up and up like completely evil. They have some humour to them. And I think that's the idea, is that they try and obviously they want there to be some flexibility. You still need to have the common trope of an angel's going to be good and a demon's going to be bad and a dragon's going to be hungry, but sometimes you can push that and you can undermine and subvert the trope a little.
Sure. All right, so we've spoken a lot about the general thematic elements of white and how they maybe translate mechanically, some of the pitfalls, some of the advantages, and yeah, I mean that to me is kind of takes us nicely to where white is now and kind of how it is.
Yeah.
But I think it is definitely worth it, and this is something I know you're keen to do, to have a look at Alpha.
Yeah. Because
this is the kind of distilled first idea of what these cards do, and maybe we can kind of see where a lot of these ideas have come from.
Yeah, like we've touched on quite a few of the bits that I'm going to try and go through, purely because they are still inherently a part of Magic, and a part of a white scholar identity. But I mean, the early conception of, like, because realistically, Richard Garfield wasn't making this game under the understanding it was going to have, a 26-year-old history. And we're going to have these massive, like, 9, 10-year story arcs. He originally wanted, obviously, to make a game that mechanically worked how he wanted it to work. One of the funny things is that all of the creatures originally didn't have they were just specific nouns, being like, say, paladin or angel, and it was that they had to go through a qualification of, say, maybe add like a qualified to it, say like Serra Angel. Give it some extra context, give it some extra flavour, and that might have been the best decision that was ever made in the original conception of Magic, because it took it from being a bunch of numbers and figures to being something that has some
more evocative.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It has something that you can kind of delve into a little bit. But the early conception is very much that white is the good colour, the just colour.
This is an alpha, right?
Yeah, there's much less moral ambiguity back then. Like, you still had black being like the evil colour, and red being like, say, the reckless colour, and green being the colour of growth, and blue being the colour of like wizards. Mm-hmm. So it was much less. Say, balanced, which I think is absolutely fine. I think the gameplay aspect for Alpha was that white established a board with, like, say, maybe 1-2 creatures, and then everything else it was doing was to protect that creature. Yeah. To build up, and they played more defensively and offensively than, say, these days, where it's more attacking than defending.
Yeah, sure.
So if you look realistic, if you're looking through, I mean, it's funny, we're talking about, say, this idea of religious iconography. There's a lot of it.
In the artwork?
In the artwork especially.
Yeah.
So you've got cards like Armageddon and Wrath of God, which obviously are biblical references. You have the White Anthem effect, which is Crusade.
Yeah, sure.
Which again is it's funny that they put it as a good thing that all white creatures get +1/+1 for white, which is, and again, something that has carried on through Magic. Like, they do a lot of anthem effects of all of your creatures getting a +1/+1, and this stems all the way back from the first set. But a Crusade isn't necessarily a good thing.
No, yeah, I don't think. Yeah, if you ask any sort of like Western Christians today, going, "Oh, what was probably the lowest point in the history of the world in terms of Christianity?" They go, "Well, the Crusades weren't the best example of what we were trying to do."
No, and it's kind of funny because if you look at it objectively, the more you look at white, and from Alpha point of view, you can kind of see if this is supposed to be the good cards, because there's a lot of farm-related cards like Farmstead, Swords to Plowshares, that kind of thing, where it's talking about, more like village life.
Yeah, sure.
Even against those cards, you're looking at like Wrath of God, Armageddon, and Crusade. Like, the good color is still representing like kind of like bad effects and like destructive.
Yeah.
Like, it's quite funny when you look at it. Because even like Balance, there's a card in the set called in Alpha called Balance, where it for the person who has the most cards in hand, everyone else discards down to that many. For the person who has the most creatures in play, everyone destroys or sacrifices the creatures down to that many. Same for lands. And it's same for enchantments. It's funny that, and even that's got a knight on it holding a holy writ, and it's almost like it feels like it's for it's a holy order, but at the same time, it's kind of kicking everyone. It doesn't feel like a nice effect.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, they're trying to have this idea of righteousness, and
that word balance. That's not
really
necessarily
important. The same. Yeah, righteousness isn't necessarily the same as being good or moral, like we've discussed previously. But I mean, it's kind of cool that they've still that idea was maybe there. I just think maybe with Alpha, it wasn't quite as intentional or nuanced as they've kind of played on it before.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe let's say that the concepts weren't so clear cut, and obviously they don't have a story basis. These are all cards in isolation.
Yeah,
there's no carrying flavour between them.
And they still use words like crusade. Like, one of my favourite white cards, and I'm going to talk about it at length later on, is Cathar's Crusade. But it's that, you put things in context of the story you're trying to tell.
And maybe also they'd also want to trope the idea of where it does this effect. Let's look at cards back that did that effect.
Or they always love using names as kind of
exactly, absolutely.
Cards,
God, they love looking like Pact of Negation, for example, and that kind of thing. So it's funny that we talk about like how it's the creature kind of like a creature community.
Yeah, sure.
Colour.
So white is the community colour.
Yeah, but it has the least number of creatures out of all of the colours in Alpha.
So white in Alpha
has 11 out. So out of its 46 cards, weirdly enough, white only had 45 because it was missing Circle of Protection white. Weirdly enough, no idea why. Beta, they corrected this. It also was missing Volcanic Island. In original. So
it didn't have the same cycle as everything else.
It technically was missing 2 cards, and it wasn't deliberate. It wasn't deliberate at all.
Oh, they
just
missed them,
changed
and then they put them in beta.
Yeah. So technically speaking,
I did not know that.
Yeah. So technically speaking, it's got 1 less card in Alpha. But I mean, for intents and purposes, out of the 46 cards meant to be printed, only 11 are creatures. Now, even blue, which is considered to be the least creature-heavy colour, that had 13 out of 46. Black had 19, green had 21, and red had 24. So it's
red had 24.
Significantly less. Yeah, significantly less. Like more than half as many as red did.
Right.
So it's funny that I mean, this is kind of balanced out by the fact it has 2 cycles of protective spells. It has a cycle of 5 enchantments that sit on the battlefield. Circle of Protection white, Circle of Protection black, Circle of Protection blue, blah 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 blah.
So these are all enchantments.
Yeah. And they sit in play, and you can pay one generic to prevent all damage of a colour of that choice to you. So it's a way for you to protect yourself from your opponent's attacks. Then it also has a cycle of 5 wards: green ward, white ward, black ward, blue ward, blah 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 blah.
Are these enchantments?
These are enchantments as well. These are auras, and they're a single white to put onto a creature, and it gives it protection from that colour. So you've got a cycle of 5 enchantments that protect your creatures from a colour, and a cycle of 5 enchantments that protect you from a colour.
So white in Alpha is particularly enchantment heavy.
It's very enchantment heavy, and only white and green could really directly remove them. There are other colours have effects that punish you for it. So blue has in blue in Alpha it had an effect that you would have to pay 2 mana or take 2 damage at the beginning of your upkeep unless if you had when it was enchanted to this enchanted permanent enchanted enchantment. There's a lot of enchantments in Alpha.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there's quite a few across the colours as well.
I think cards like Disenchant and Naturalize in Alpha, or
yeah, exactly.
So you're right. These green and white.
Is that those are the 2 which still to this day are still printed.
Yeah.
Disenchant's still played in Legacy because it's the best white option, even at 2 mana, just to straight up instant speed destroy an artifact or enchantment. But they were the only 2 colours that could directly remove them. And there are a lot of other enchantments across the colours in Alpha as well, but these are directly ones that do nerf specific colours. There's a lot of colour hosing as well in Alpha, which is kind of funny. Cards that specifically don't like other colours. So there's a card in it called Karma, where it deals 1 damage for each swamp that an opponent controls to them. Which is, again, they have these almost like these direct
matchups.
Yeah, matchups across all the different colours that don't like each other. But there's a lot of protection in white. It also has cards like reverse damage, where instead of being dealt damage, all the damage you were dealt by one source, instead you gain that much life instead for 1 white instant.
Yeah.
So it's got a lot of ways of the creatures that you have in play surviving, and the creature that you have in play getting bigger. So it's got cards like Blessing, which is a white sits on the creature, and again an enchantment, and then you can pay a single white mana to give it +1/+1. Now this kind of effect typically is now moved over to red with like fire breathing.
Yeah.
Where for a red you get +1/+0. You don't see so much I can pay 8 white mana into making this creature a +8/+8. You just don't see that quite so much anymore. But in Alpha it was clearly a thing it wanted to focus on. Because there was another card that also does the same kind of thing of where you gives the creature +0/+2, and then you can pay an additional white to give it an additional +0/+2. So this idea of the enchantments that sit in play, and you can use all your excess mana to buff that creature up again.
Yeah.
Which is quite interesting.
I mean, that's kind of odd that's how they've kind of tried to express this colour this early on, and now it's kind of removed.
Yeah. So it makes up for the fact it doesn't have as many creatures to attack with, to make the ones that it does have to attack with very potent.
Which is, I mean, I guess you can kind of find that idea in Voltron strategies with equipment on creatures.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's very far removed from the idea of doing the kind of gather the townsfolk, everything buffs everything up. I mean,
no, this is almost like it's go tall rather than go wide.
Yeah.
Now, the Magic over the course of the years, like this idea of community has moved white more into the go wide strategy. Whereas clearly in Alpha, it wanted more of a go tall, where you could kind of shore up your one creature, even especially with its iconic creature of the set being Serra Angel.
Yeah.
yes, there was Sheevan Dragon in this in Alpha, the 5/5 for 6 that has fire breathing from red, which was the other big creature.
Yeah.
You also have Mahamati Jin from blue, which is 6 mana for a 4/5 flying, which is 5/6 flying, which outclasses Sarah Angel by a considerable margin. But because Sarah Angel has flying and vigilance, it was so much better because if you could chuck one of the wards on it, your opponents couldn't really do anything about the fact you can attack with it and you can't block it, and it can block and not take any damage.
Yeah, I really love the idea that vigilance is in white. So vigilance, I think, is obviously one of the key white evergreen mechanics, right? Abilities. And I love, like, for me, if I was to pick one ability that would say, what is a white ability? Vigilance is the one. So I think it's really nice that is in Alpha, and that's not something that, say, another colour had that got moved over or whatever else.
I think the idea that white clearly wanted to have from Rich Garfield was that you wanted to establish a board early, because it even has Savannah Lines, a 2/1 for 1. Yeah. Which is a very powerful, even to this day, like, you don't get 2/1s for 1 with no downside. You get better cards now.
You get straight up better magic.
But the whole point is that even from the get-go, like, white had a greater power and toughness to mana cost ratio than other colours, apart from, say, green.
Yeah.
With no downside. Like, red would get them with must attack each turn, or things like that, whereas white got it without any real downside. So it's almost like it knew that it needed to be the colour it wanted to be proactively attacking.
Sure.
But then in Alpha, you've got all of these different spells and all these different cards, especially cards like Castle, that specifically want to have you untapped.
Is this card literally just called Castle?
Called Castle, yeah. And it basically gives your untapped creatures +0/+2.
Yeah.
So it's
an anthem effect.
Essentially, yeah. It's a toughness anthem.
Right.
effect.
So, like, talking about Alpha, like, I mean, obviously, we could do a whole episode individually on just Alpha and how it expresses its stuff. But what I'm getting from Alpha and what I'm sort of hearing is that it had quite strong enchantment synergies, and it had a lot of these anthem abilities, which, I mean, obviously a lot of enchantments in white are anthems as well, but you get anthems on creatures and whatever else also. Are you sort of like happy with like our discussion on Alpha, or like you're right to move on?
There's only one other card I want to mention, because it's utterly ridiculous. Righteousness. It gives a blocking creature +7/+7 for a single white mana.
Is it an aura or what?
No, that's an instant.
It's an instant.
So, considering, obviously, like, the idea of it being clearly, white wasn't supposed to be an aggressive colour. It was clearly supposed to be the colour, and it's the fact it's called Righteousness.
Yeah.
For a single white mana to give +7/+7, that is crazy. And the only reason is because, it's not attacking. No. It's just blocking. I'm like, that's ridiculous. That's like this little knight, like, okay, you've got a goblin going over to attack your knight, and you go, hey, you're righteous. And it goes, yeah, absolutely, and just completely pounds it into the ground. Righteousness. That's white in a nutshell.
But do you know what? You have effects like that all the time. Things like Condemn.
I mean, it was still been printed in Eldraine. It was still printed in Eldraine. It's the one where it's got Prince, whatever his name is, taking out Maleficent. That trope, the knight against the dragon. Still Righteousness.
Yeah.
So even to this day, like in the latest standard set, it's still very much a white ability, and it's still clearly not too powerful, even though it seems obnoxious.
Well, no, because you're right. It's white isn't being aggressive. It's reactive.
Exactly.
And it's things like, like Condemn or Settle the Wreckage.
You need to be attacking me for me to be able to kill it. I mean, Swords to Plowshares and Path to Exile aside, because they are quintessentially not only very, very, very good spells, but much more applicable than, say, the other. They don't
break the colour pie, though. They bend it, because they still give you a land or
exactly.
life.
You're still giving something back, but there's a lot of spells that require you to be attacking. They need you to attack. I need you to come at me before I can deal with your thing.
Yeah.
Which kind of adds a kind of political element to white. And the interesting thing otherwise is that there was they tried to create specific enemies in Alpha, and black was very clearly the one that white got, because you have White Knight against Black Knight. They both had there's Bad Moon in black, which gives +1/+1 to all black creatures.
Yeah.
So there's direct
an anthem effect.
Yeah, exactly. There are direct parallels between the two colours that are trying to compete.
Although doesn't Bad Moon gives +1/+1 to all black creatures?
Yeah, no, Crusade does all white creatures as well.
All white creatures.
Back then, even with things like Goblin King or
Lord of Atlantis.
Lord of Atlantis, thank you.
Oh, yeah, nice. I took a shot in the dark there. Yeah,
all of the cards that, all of the anthem effects were fair. They were parity effects, and there was a lot of this. There's very little asymmetrical effects. There's a few, like when we get to red, like it's Boil and things like that, which are just arse arse cards. So
hey, do you like your lands?
yeah, well, mate,
Go on.
Yeah, thanks. Cheers. Bye.
Thanks. Hope you enjoy playing blue.
Yeah, but I mean, clearly the idea with white was that, and the removal it got was fair. It was either Wrath of God, it was Swords to Plowshares with opponent gain life back. Clearly they didn't know how to measure the power of certain things because white gets life gain only in very small amounts. There's only like two or three cards that gain life. But
I suppose we haven't spoken much about life gain, have we?
yeah, but the thing about life gain is that it's very easily it's made obsolete quite easily. Because it's not the idea of why it's not good is it doesn't help you win the game. It just stops you losing a little bit.
Yeah.
And it has become, it's very difficult for you to not, if you're not leveraging it into other forms of value, like, say, Dawn of Hope, or if you're using cards like, say, Philinda Sovereign, or things like that. If you're not using, or a Flux Reservoir is in a white card, but if you're not using the life gain as a resource for advantage, which white very rarely does, black's the one that does that, then it's not really benefiting you too much.
I don't know, life gain, I think
it's great for racing, which in a limited point of view, Lifelink's really, really good for white because it wants to be in attacking early and it gives you the life buff that you can afford to take some late damage to get in the little last
I suppose
bit.
we haven't spoken about life gain as a white thematic idea because actually the kind of trading off of life resources is shared amongst white and
exactly.
black, right?
Yeah, black kind of also takes it a little bit as well. With the whole vampires have become much more prevalent. I mean, I say much more; they've always been around, but they're a lot more prevalent in recent sets.
But yeah, lifelink on black
works
creatures isn't like a.
It doesn't feel weird at all.
No.
So yeah, it does. It's almost like you don't. It's almost like it feels sub almost a little bit to white now because it just doesn't. It just can't use it in ways that seems to make it. Better as a colour, so it's almost easier
playing
to
a life
forget
game
about
deck,
it.
you need the white for the accumulation and you need the black for the resource management.
And it maybe is harder to justify as a pure effect because life drain, like life link sounds nice. If they called it life drain, it wouldn't feel like a white effect.
No.
And it does feel more like life drain than it does life link.
100%, because you have to take away the damage.
How is me hitting you with a sword making me and me gaining the advantage? I feel like a white thing, you know? Like, I've just stabbed you with a sword and I'm sucking the life out of you. Hey, come join my church. You know? How does that work?
I'm going to headbutt myself healthily.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what the hell does that even work? So, yeah, it kind of maybe that's why... I mean, it's still very much a white mechanic. But, yeah, maybe it's not quite so...
I wouldn't say it's tropey to white. No, yeah, you've convinced me.
Yeah.
Cool. So, I want to kind of move on from Alpha now because I think it's nice to look at.
Wait, one other thing. Resurrection.
Yeah, one more.
Resurrection.
It
was the only colour that did a direct reanimation. You had Animate Dead in black, but it was an enchantment version that had a massive caveat towards it. It was the only colour that actually got the direct. You come back from the dead. I'm only saying that because moving forwards into looking at how white's represented now and how it can maybe look to better itself, I think that kind of idea of recursion is really important.
Sure.
Cool. Right, that's it. I'm done.
That's cool. No, it's fine. We could just talk about Alpha forever. But I mean, the modern game isn't like Alpha, and there are definitely certain things that even after Alpha, like we spoke a lot about community and the idea that you need like lots of little creatures to build up board presence. Yeah. But there's a lot of things, and this is why I think white is considered honestly just a little bit shit, or maybe just doesn't have its own thing anymore.
Well, I guess
because there's been certain things that have fallen to the wayside. Yeah. So, for example, things like token generation.
Yeah. It's this idea of the go wide effect. Like you did.
Yeah, that's not white anymore.
Yeah, you did have lots of cards like Raise the Alarm, Gather the Townsfolk, Triplicate Spirits. Lingering Souls, yes, is a little bit black, but you also had the Spectral Procession. Yeah. There are lots of white spells, which is why White Weenie's always been a thing.
Sure, but then you have red does tokens.
Exactly. Everything like Hordling Outburst. Yeah, exactly. Like green does it with elf tokens. Even blue does it with all these wizard tokens recently. Like token generation, this idea of making additional bodies on the board that aren't necessarily represented by a specific card instead by a token, shouldn't be specific to one colour. No. They might be better at it, but for me, it's not even that tokens are a white thing, it's 1/1 tokens are a white thing.
For me, what it is that for when they make a planeswalker or when they make a new cycle of something. So we saw it recently in the castle cycle for Eldraine. It seems to be that when they do specific abilities in a cycle for each of the colour pie, for all the other four colours, they tend to go, yes, this is the black thing, this is the red thing, this is the blue thing, and then for white they go, oh, we don't really know what white does.
Is it gaining life? Is it putting a counter on it? Or is it just making a token?
Should we make a token?
It's almost like they spin a wheel and they go one of four different kind of crappy options.
Yeah, and that could have been on anything.
Yeah, okay, blue... The thing is, blue's one Scry. I get that, cool, but Scry's evergreen already, but it still feels better to be in blue when you want the manipulation. Yeah. Then if you put it into white, it would feel kind of strange, but you're not even drawing a card, so is Scry even a bad thing that should go into white? Or should it be maintained as evergreen? If it's maintained as evergreen, why does blue always bloody get it?
Well, I mean, green gets quite a lot of scry as well.
Yeah, I guess.
I mean, but my point being is that I think tokens should be maybe more pushed in white.
Yeah.
But they've done it for so long now where they've kind of given it such a lackluster go, and it seems to be the afterthought. And anyway, every other colour thematically does it in its own way.
Green always has a token doublers. Divine Visitation is one of the only ones recently, apart from Anointed Procession. Like, you can clearly tell that they've seen this themselves a little bit.
Right.
Because you had Doubling Season, Parallel Lives, Second Harvest.
Yeah.
Even Reese the Redeemed. Okay, he's a half white card, so fair enough. That's it's a bit of a bend.
He's an elf. He's green.
But it's also a green card. Like, Anointed Procession is like a doubling effect for tokens. Which, yes, because Embalm was in that set in white specifically, it worked quite nicely. Divine Visitation, again, white was the card that was making more tokens, so turning them into turning 1/1 soldier tokens into 4/4 flying.
It's great.
It actually does work really, really
well. So
well.
they've obviously tried to push it, right? But is it now? Again, it's just not thematically. I don't think within each of those individual sets it was fine, but I don't think you can call tokens like a broadly speaking white thing anymore. And at least they should just make it more impactful. Like, yes, Divine Visitation, definitely a step in the right direction. Anointed Procession, sure. Like, I love Anointed Procession, and it's in my Queen Marchesa deck for exactly the reason that it can double all the tokens. But weirdly enough, in that deck, the only other thing that makes white tokens is Elspeth Sun's Champion.
Yeah.
Everything else I'm doing is black thralls or zombies
you were saying
or whatever else.
Planeswalkers tend to always make tokens as well, realistically. I mean, it's one of the easiest way for white Planeswalkers to protect themselves.
But it's too easy, and I don't think it for me anyway, if you were to say, hey, tokens is a white thing, I'd go, yeah, as an afterthought. Everything else does it anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think it's lost out there. I think something which, and again, this is something which in EDH, I think this is more specific, but I think because it's not even good enough for a lot of competitive play, is the land destruction aspect of things. That is a very white idea. Yes, red does have it as well, but it started with white, and I think the idea of, this board parity is very white thing. But people don't want to play all those effects because they're too oppressive.
This is something we're going to look at when we talk about ways that it can get better. Like, I have a good idea for how we can interact with lands, because that's one of the things that if one of white's hang-ups is this inability to ramp them, and it does work within this taxation effect, then maybe taxing other people's lands is the way to go. Not in such an oppressive fashion as it's been done in the past. But I think it's definitely somewhere that it can look to flex a little bit more into, and it can fight on a tactic that doesn't normally get fought on very well.
Sure, but I mean, I think, and I said this earlier on, I definitely think that white has legs in areas which are actually more thematic than just straight mechanically. So everyone wants white to have more card draw. Everyone wants white to have more mana ramp, but they don't know how to do it naturally within the colour palette.
Because we had 3 cards that have done the card draw thing are Mentor of the Meek, where any creature with power 2 or less comes into play under your control, whether it's token or otherwise, you can pay a mana and draw a card. This idea of whenever you get a little guy along, you give it a little bit of a bump and you get some little benefit out of it, which works. Dawn of Hope. You can whenever you gain life, you can pay. I think is it 2? I think it's 2. You pay 2, and then you can draw a card. Which is, again, you're relying on the things that white normally does to give it advantage.
Dawn of Hope also has a token generation.
Exactly, 3 and a white to make a 1/1 lifelink. So you're not only making a dude
and lifelink. It's
got the lifelink to help. But and then you've also got Bygone Bishop. Which whenever you cast a creature of 3 or less converted to mana cost, you investigate.
You get a clue token.
It's cast, so it's a little bit more straddled by the fact you can't use token generation to work for it.
Yeah, but you do have to pay,
and you have to think
for but you do have to crack the clues. So you are still paying for it.
Yeah, exactly. But also you have So so those are like the 3 that have recently kind of come that have like direct. Repeated card advantage, and Maro's gone on record stating that the other 2, like Dawn of Hope and Mentor of the Meek, are cards that technically bend the colour pile. I'm like, I don't really understand how.
They don't.
You can't tell me that a colour can't. This is one of the things that he says, that white shouldn't be able to draw cards unconditionally.
Well, it's not unconditional.
But it's not unconditionally. And also, he says they shouldn't be able to draw cards consistently. And it's like, but then at that point, you're literally saying...
You're saying, but all the other colours do.
Yeah, exactly. So that's where this frustration comes from. Because I'm very much I'm a devil's advocate. I think the reason why white currently is getting such a big shtick is because EDH is such a massive focus, especially when they keep releasing all these legends. And even we've recently had Daxos, Sun's Sun's Champion?
Blessed by the
Blessed
Sun.
by the Sun, yeah.
Which is the new legendary for
yeah.
the new Theros
And
block.
already people are moaning about how it's too generic. I mean, it's a bloody uncommon.
It's an uncommon legendary.
It's an uncommon,
yeah.
and it's a white, and it has the Soul Sister effect of whenever a creature enters the battlefield, you gain a life. Whenever a creature you control dies, you gain a life, and its devotion, your devotion to white is its toughness.
Yeah.
So it's a 2/2 to begin with, because it's a white creature. And then anything else buffs it up. And people are complaining, not only is it not good enough to be a commander, which it's a bloody uncommon, but two, also it's a flavour fail. I'm like, for once, I disagree, because your backside, like your big butt being dictated by what your devotion to the colour that you're blessed by works, and he's literally straddled he's died and he's come back as a return, and now he's back as a demigod.
I haven't thought
so
much about
anything
it.
coming into play and out of play works with the life gain, and it works as succinctly as tough. High toughness is a white thing naturally anyway, because they want to be more defensive, as we've seen all the way going back to alpha. But also the life gain and anything enters or dies is also works within the context of the character. But the point being that people want there to be mono white viability for EDH, and sometimes if you're working with a pie, you get a bit of crust. And unfortunately, white's bit of crust is the fact that it can't do all the things. And this is the problem. If Maro's saying things like it shouldn't be able to get unconditional draw, it shouldn't be able to get consistent draw, then you are limiting its viability. And the thing is, this is what we say, and this is what we said earlier. The problem is that if you're limiting it to the ability it already has, and those abilities don't scale well, I mean, yes, okay, the game wasn't created with EDH in mind, and the colour pie wasn't created with EDH in mind, under the understanding that every colour should be able to do a little bit of everything, because that's not how the colour pie works.
No, but
each colour should have the opportunity.
And also, it's not unconditional.
Like,
even red has card draw where you have to discard, or it's impulsive card draw where you might just lose the card into the
next
exile.
Turn, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not unconditional. I mean, there's even been lots of calls by a lot of different people saying that if Rustic Studies was a new card that was being printed now, it would probably be white. Because you have to tax. I mean, I would say it would probably still have to be.
It'd be more expensive. There is no way you make it.
It'd be maybe like a sort of 3 white, I think.
Yeah, or so you think 3 white to begin, so a 5 mana to begin with. I think it should be 2 to. No, I see. Yeah. I think
I'd have to be mid to late game.
Or I think I'd be 2 white. I think is fine. I think 4 would be fine. Because I think the problem is if you do it
I don't think they'd do it 2 white.
If you do it too late, especially this is the thing, if we're looking at ways to show up EDH, then you need it to be a spell that's relevant early. And again, maybe we just the idea is that a lot of people are saying, we understand that there are certain ways that you can get around it, like playing artifacts and that kind of thing, but that's not the point. The whole point is that you want this understand. They understand that white's got these problems. Like there's a few cards back in the day, like Truce, where you'd pay 3 mana, you draw 2 cards, and target opponent would draw 2 cards. It's like you shouldn't have to give away 2 cards and cost a card just to get yourself 2 cards back.
Yeah.
Like the difference between that and divination is obnoxious.
Yeah.
And you could argue that white strategies are more solid and more and firmer, but over the years, because they've made each colour quite powerful in its own way, not having the ability to keep up in advantage, whether it's virtual advantage in cards or mana advantage and that kind of thing, it's difficult. It's difficult to justify it not being a weaker colour.
Okay. So what you're saying with maybe where what needs to move forwards both thematically and mechanically is that it's not a bend in the colour pie to have taxable draw effects like Mentor of the Meek. That's actually where they should be leaning into.
Exactly.
Give us more Mentor of the Meeks. Give us more of those kinds of things.
Absolutely.
I mean, Dawn of Hope was very recent, as is Divine Visitation. They're both was it Ravnica Allegiance?
Yeah.
Yeah. So they are recent.
They are, yeah. But the fact that it's also been, erratic, or the fact that Varys said that, this would be considered a bend, is that you need to maybe look at it's no longer bending, it's just moving where the colour pie needs to fit
naturally
into.
shifting.
Like Happily Ever After, okay, you both draw cards and you gain some life, but, I mean, you're still giving away, you shouldn't have to give away advantage to gain advantage. You might need to jump through some hoops to gain advantage. Yeah. Or you might want to limit your opponent's advantage. Like, the cards that I love are things like the Leonin that's from the cat deck, where whenever your opponent... Arms Collector. So whenever your opponent draws more than their first card each turn, instead you draw a card.
Is that Leonin Arbiter?
Yeah. No, it's Arms Collector. And it's instead... You both draw a card. So it doesn't stop them from drawing.
Yeah.
It stops them from drawing 10. It allows them to only draw 1, but you also get to draw 1.
Is Leonin Arbiter the one which actually they can't search the library
unless they pay 2?
Pay 2. Yeah. There you go, another great tax
Exactly.
effect. Yeah.
And this is the thing, like, they've got the ideas of it all there, but...
they just seem unwilling to push into it.
Yeah, and also your options are... we're saying these cards as if there are loads of options. These tend to be the only option of that particular
Mentor
type.
of the Meek ends up in quite a few EDH decks.
Mentor of the Meek and Bygone Bishop are the only two cards of that particular type that do that thing. So you don't have any more options.
No.
And because you don't have all the tutor effects or anything like that in white, typically, again, this is what relegates it to being a support colour, because you need the other colours to get the other half of your shit going.
Yeah.
And at that point, if you've got using that colour, you probably just want to use their better spells at doing the things that white's trying to do anyway.
For me, I think they should absolutely lean more into Anthem effects.
Yeah.
Anthem effects for me are something which white does, which no other colour does anywhere near as often or well, nor should it. Because Anthem effects fire on all cylinders for white for me.
Yeah, exactly.
It's about community. It ties together your own team. It's a permanent. Because it usually comes in enchantment form or in creature form. So they're permanents on the battlefield. Thematically, it ties into everything that white wants to do.
Yeah.
And it also mechanically helps you out. Because whether you're playing a 40 card, 60 card format, so if you're playing limited or something like that, then it will make sure that your deck runs a lot smoother. Because it doesn't matter if you have to splash white for the Anthem, fine. And then it makes your Gruul deck work a lot better. It works in big battle cruiser formats like EDH because you can abuse it and you can use it in other ways that you wouldn't necessarily do. You create 50 tokens on the board.
Yeah, because you don't want it to be something like
5/5s.
You don't want it to be like Battalion or Mentor, which are typical. Yeah, okay, these are both Boris aligned mechanics, but you don't want them to be things like you have to attack with 3 creatures to get a buff, or you have to attack with the smaller creature for it to get a counter. Because it's not.
That turns white into an aggressive colour.
And it also means that you're relying on smaller creatures, and you're relying on strategies that aren't particularly powerful.
Yeah,
they don't scale well. Again, looking at Pioneer, White Weenie is still a viable deck, and in Standard there will always be a viable White Weenie deck because the limited format will always make a bunch of white small creatures that probably have an ability that helps you with attacking. And again, this is maybe part of the inherent problem. If white's viability in competitive Magic is only one specific archetype, typically, there are some other archetypes out there that it works well with. Maybe looking at different niche strategies, but specifically, if White Weenie is one of the most consistent ones, you want your colour to still be identifiable to that. But maybe that's the fact that is the only competitive format is indicative of there being a problem.
Yeah.
And Anthem effects need to scale up. Like now, you're getting creatures like you get creatures like Questing Beast, and yet you can't make a 3-mana enchantment that gives all your creatures +2/+2.
Well, I think
I mean, they did it with the Mirrodin set, with Tempered Steel, where all artifact creatures got +2/+2. That didn't break anything. That's fine. And artifact creatures are even easier to run than white creatures. Yeah. Maybe make it more restrictive that you have to have more. I would like it if white was the more devoted colour in Theros Beyond.
Well, so I'm looking at Benalish Marshal, which is from Dominaria. So it's it's white for a 3/3 human knight, and it says other creatures you control get +1/+1. Now it fires on a lot of good ways. It says all other creatures, not just token or non-token,
or humans,
which I hate. That's something that white tends to do. Is they always try and clarify what kinds of creatures you can buff.
Instead of just being generic.
Just be generic. It's a community colour.
Yeah.
Always watching is an enchantment from Shadows over Innistrad that I love thematically. It's the one white for an enchantment that says all non-token creatures get +1/+1
and vigilance.
Yeah. Brilliant. Non-token creatures
in a set where it's
you keep insisting that white is this token,
and then it's in a set
colour.
where you're showing all these angels in the artwork, and the angels in that set were the tokens.
Yeah,
so it's not even actually representing something that it should be.
No,
doing.
It was crazy. So Benalish Marshal, going back to Benalish Marshal, you're saying that it's actually quite a good thing, or at least it's a viable restriction that it's white.
Yeah, because you obviously that was part of a cycle of triple colour spells.
But it doesn't do anything. I mean, all right.
But it almost feels like you're restricting yourself to only being white, which again, you're limiting yourself to certain strategies regardless. But why couldn't it? Why
couldn't it have been +1/+1 and vigilance?
Yeah, exactly. Something like that. Maybe that little bit. Maybe
or again, +2/+2.
Maybe we're expecting too much and pushing.
Well, no, I don't
think
we are though. Because all right. Because I'm talking about it, I'm a singleton player, right? And maybe this comes into a format, say if you're in limited, where you can have as many as you like in your deck, or even constructed, whether it's
abusive.
4
If you go, say, 1 drop, 2 drop, Benalish Marshal.
I don't think it's too much.
And also the other thing as well, you have to realise that this is a temporary buff. This isn't like giving counters to everything.
No.
Which, again, we didn't necessarily touch on the +1/+1 counters, because that's, again, a generic thing that you kind of get across all. But in general, the idea of a +1/+1 counter to your whole team is so much better because it's a permanent buff.
It's a permanent buff.
So, but whereas if you remove one of those Benalish Marshals, if you're mid-combat, not only have you got rid of the 3/3, but you've probably got rid of maybe 7 power toughness across the board by doing this.
And I just think, I think it's ridiculous.
And it's just so weak. I mean, okay, again, we're probably nitpicking quite specifically here, but these are ways that we can. Because every set's gonna most sets are gonna have some amount of Anthem anyway. If you're doing a tribal set, like say with Ixalan, there was a +1/+1 rule. insert creature type here card for each of the tribes, because there were going to be, because it's a tribal set, fair enough. But white should work with this idea of the more resources you have, the more they exponentially grow each other.
I don't think that's
easy to pick
I don't
them apart.
think that's nitpicking either.
Because most colours will have, green will have a fight card that will allow it to deal with a creature, and usually has a bigger creature enough that it can kill something that's up to a 5 toughness.
Yeah.
Black automatically will have removal spells that will be able to kill it. Like red will have a burn spell that will be able to kill it if you get it early enough. Like there's blue can bounce or counter. That most of the other cards have ways to answer these effects. And yeah, you could argue it might become too oppressive. And this is maybe where you could counter argument. Whereas if you don't want the colour to be specifically all about creatures, maybe anthem effects are the wrong way to go, but then you're not really giving
I don't think so, because you can play with it. We're obviously talking about buffs as in like +1/+1, this, that and the other, but they don't have to be necessarily like power toughness buffs. You can have this idea, you can move white into being, I mean, I think we're overrunning now anyway, but I think there's something to be said that you could make white the primary enchantment colour. Yeah. So green has got everything going under the sun.
Well, again, they've released this bloody spoiler with the Setessan Enchantress, where she's like...
It's just another green Enchantress.
It's 2/3, yeah, whenever you play an enchantment, she gets +1/+1 catch, you draw a card. Why couldn't that have been white?
Why couldn't that have been white?
Why couldn't that have been white? I mean, I understand, yeah, maybe... Green has always had this Enchantress effects, but if you're trying to move white into having its own niche, green's already got a lot of other things that it can do. Just move it a little bit over.
So just move it a little bit over, because white does have a history
it's tertiary,
of having enchantment synergies.
Exactly.
So I'm saying, what I'm saying is that the buffs from anthem effects and the buffs from enchantments don't necessarily all need to be the same thing. They don't need to be narrow, but I think they should encourage you. If you want to sit down at a pre-release and go, right, I'm feeling like playing white, people want to skew one way or another, or if you're drafting and you want to like skew one way or another, you know that when you're playing white, you're going to be able to have board state advantage, and you're going to have powerful buffs with lots of little pieces making a grander whole.
Like Squadron Hawk was a really good example of a nice card. It was a 1/1 flyer, which automatically was good in a format that had very powerful equipment following off from Mirrodin, but it got you 3 more 1/1 flyers from your deck into your hand. That's a 1/1 flyer that draws you 3 cards that are also 1/1 flyer. That's the kind of card that I think was really, really, really clever. And I think it's the best version of it. And there have been other ones that do the similar thing where they've been massively scaled back. But that was a really, really good example of it. And yeah, okay, maybe made one of the most oppressive standard decks ever. But that's fine, you know.
Oh yeah, but
that's because Jason the Mind Sculptor, Battle Skull, Stoneforge maybe had some other things to do with that.
Yeah. You look at the past, sort of even 2 to 3 years of standard Magic now. I think you can look at Simic as being way too oppressive. I don't think having an oppressive deck in any sort of meta is
we won't talk about the Elk Man.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, well, he's gone now anyway. Yeah. But I just want to cap off by saying, from my point of view anyway, is saying that my archetypal white card, because you asked me what my archetypal colour card was, is Cathar's Crusade, which is the 3 white enchantment from original Innistrad block that says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a 1/1 counter on each other creature you control.
Each creature.
On each.
It includes
itself. There you go then. So it fires on all cylinders. It's got the Cathars, which were essentially the knight trope of Innistrad, on the hill, on their horses, ready to make the charge. It's a white enchantment, which gives you the permanent thing. It's a permanent buff in terms of anthem effects. Gives it 1/1 counters.
And it's utterly ridiculous in some like you can go ham on it.
Well, also, but it encourages you to have lots of creatures, and it doesn't matter if they're like little white weenies or if they're tokens. It doesn't make any distinction. It just goes all
non-discriminant.
Give us more of that. Don't give me bloody Belnish Marshall that as soon as you remove it goes, and I had to pump 3 white mana into it. Yeah. Don't give me all of this, like, it has to attack to get the buff.
You're forcing me to play white a lot, like Linden. Like, give me something worth it.
Yeah, give me something worth it, and that is for me where white falls down. Is it has these examples of where they can take this colour. It has it in the taxation effects for like card draw things like Mentor of the Meek. It has it in things like Smothering Tithe, which is another recent card, and it has it in anthem effects and enchantments. And I think Wizards, they simply refuse to acknowledge that is maybe what White's tropes are now.
Yeah. For me, my quintessential white card was Rule of Law. This idea that you only get to play 1 spell each turn, each player, universal, nice and fair, succinct.
Another enchantment.
My where we can move forwards to is that I don't want there to be, say, cards like Armageddon. I don't want necessarily to be cards like Stone Rain. I think
they can get rid of that now. That's fine.
But what I wouldn't mind is, say, if you pay a say white for an enchantment, and when it comes into play for each player, you tap a land and it remains tapped as long as that enchantment's in play.
Yeah.
Or if you do, say, 2 white and it does it for 2 lands. So 1v1, you're holding yourself back for 2 lands, but you're keeping your opponent off 2 lands. And in a multiplayer, obviously, it scales. I mean, yeah, these are the kind of cards that are very douchey. People don't like playing against them. But if you're unwilling to give white advantage in the ways that it needs to gain advantage, then you need to give it ways to combat opponents' advantage when they're going to be able to get the advantage out of this.
Yeah.
Like, balance is a fantastic card because it also attacks your hand, it attacks the board, and it attacks your mana base. It is absurdly oppressive, and it's a very powerful effect. But these are the kind of things that white initially had to balance out its inherent disadvantages. And protection's kind of getting faded out, so you've already lost 10 cards out of that original alpha set that are even viable to play.
Yeah.
But if you're not looking at ways to shore up the disadvantages that even Garfield originally saw and identified, then you're going to do that colour a disservice.
Yeah.
And again, it's mostly because the zeitgeist topic at the moment is that white by itself as a standalone colour is struggling significantly.
Yeah. I mean, so I think...
And it might just be the thing that everyone wants to be complaining about.
Yeah,
right
I guess. I mean, we've talked maybe more than we should have done about them, like the hard mechanics of white, but I think it's because that is what is in trouble for white at the moment. I actually think storyline-wise and thematically, white is very strong, and the idea that it doesn't have its own colour identity is actually a little bit of a disservice to the colour as well.
Because it's very easy to have to represent the protagonist of Magic. I mean, okay, fair enough. In Eldraine, it was they were blue and red.
Well, no, but I think with white, it's the fact that because white is meant to be about the everyday sort of morality and the everyday righteousness, whether that's justified or not, it's less in your face evocative than say the chaos of red, or the selfishness of black,
or the intellect of blue, or the primal strength of green.
Yeah, exactly.
It does feel maybe a bit whitewashed. It does feel a little bit like washed out, because it's not something that you aspire to. You don't aspire to be righteous, do you?
I like to think I do.
Whereas I don't know. I guess that's the idea of.
I mean, that's just me. I'm sorry.
In D&D, I never go for the character that's good. Though at the same time, I don't like ever really pissing anyone off. So I don't know. Maybe I'm devil's advocate myself here. But as you can clearly see, like white, it has suffered. It doesn't suffer necessarily to bridge the gap between its mechanics and its flavour, but maybe moving forwards, it needs to balance its downsides better. Obviously do it in a justifiable way, but there are plenty of ways for it to be able to justify it. Like, I think that the colour identity of white is probably one of the most solid ones, and one of the ones that's most easy to play around with.
Sure. Okay, well, we've spoken at length about this. Obviously, I think we've been a little bit more heated with this one than with other colours that we'll talk about, but just because I think white is the most difficult one to wade through at the moment, especially where it is now. If you guys have any comments or any suggestions about your ideas about white, where it can go, what it can do, maybe if you have any favourite white cards from previous sets, or any tropes that you might want to see return, which are maybe at the wayside now, then let us know. You can like, comment, subscribe, share, do all of the stuff that the format that you listen to us to allows you to do, wherever that may be. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you for listening to our ranting.
Incessant ranting. Alright guys, thank you very much for listening to Magic the Flavouring. We'll see you next time.
See you soon.